Hello everyone, welcome back to my lair. Very warm welcome to you as well. Warm because I'm freezing cold actually. It got cold in my garage. Lair. And so here we are. So if I start shivering or turning blue or something, that's why. So I am really excited about today's topic. I'm really excited about this because I love annoying my friends with this. I love the whole thing. I'm big into swords. I think they're really cool. And unfortunately, I only own one, and it's neither a katana or a longsword. But there's actually a lot of people discussing this particular topic of longswords and katanas and which one's better, right? I mean, there's Skolagrim and Shadiversity. Cerberus Arms, his video is actually the one that prompted me to actually embark on my own tirade. I mean, I've been interested in this for quite some time. I think since Gunny did that comparison of the two on TV, however many years ago. Anyway, I think he started off the whole controversy. But yeah, the Cerberus Arms one, I'll be reacting to a few things in that. But I wanted to add in my own 2 cents. And the reason why, or at least I should say the big reason why, is that because I think most of these, with the exception of Gunny's, by the way, I think the big problem with a lot of their assessments is that they're very fair. And you might be thinking, well, hang on a second, that's kind of odd. Why would it be a problem for these to be fair? Well, I'll tell you why, is because we're talking about weapons here, and when we're talking about a fight to the death, a duel, a battle, you do not want the odds to be fair, right? I mean, if I'm going to be in a fight, I want the odds to be overwhelmingly stacked in my favor. And as it happens, one of these weapons is objectively better than the other. It's the longsword. Clearly, the longsword is a better weapon than the katana. Now, I guess if that's all you needed to hear, then wish you a fond farewell, all that kind of business. But there's a few things that I actually feel like I need to address that some of the other commentators on this and experts have been saying before showing you how, in fact, the longsword is a better weapon. And first off, and by the way, this is a spoiler, so if you haven't already done so, go watch Cerberus Arms' video. Just look up Cerberus Arms. I'll put a link to it in my description here because I think it's really well done. His production quality is way better than mine. The dude is a genuine pleasure to watch. He's funny. So first off, he concludes that ultimately the debate doesn't matter. And you might say, well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, what are the chances that I'm going to find myself in like a dystopian movie and need to choose a medieval weapon with which to vanquish my friends for televised entertainment? Probably never. I mean, who knows? Things have been going crazy, so stranger things have happened. But of course, it does matter. I mean, of course it matters, this question, right? I mean, if the question of which sword didn't matter, which sword is better didn't matter, why would you be sitting here watching this? I mean, unless you're my mom, right? Hi, Mom. I mean, it does. Does it really matter who wins the Super Bowl? Does it really matter if Taco Bell's Crunchwrap Supreme is better than the Chalupa? Well, of course it does, because we're human beings and we have this unique ability to assign value to things beyond our basic needs. I would say, though, that the Chalupa is definitely part of our basic needs. So, is this a pertinent question? Well, duh. You've assigned value to it. Is it a fruitful exercise? Well, let's think. Do you have to think deeply about it? Do you need to conduct research to support your conclusions? Do you have to process information critically to come to those very conclusions? So Cerberus Arms, I'm talking to you. I disagree. That'd be pretty cool if you actually watch this. Yes, the question matters. And I'll even go further. I'll actually even say that exploring the question is a valuable exercise in and of itself. And my second point, again, is another reaction to Cerberus Arms. And again, spoiler, go watch his video. He makes another analogy in his video and uses it to argue that swords are actually the two swords in question are actually too different to really be compared. Again, I disagree. I'll be analyzing, or addressing, I should say, his analogy later on, but for now I think that a little bit about the use of the swords in their prime should show that they're actually far more similar than they are different, and thus a comparison isn't outside the realm of reason. I mean, even a cursory investigation will show that they both were essentially used in the same manner. That is, they had pretty much the same purpose, just in two different parts of the world. They were both used on the battlefield. I do get the impression that the katana was used more as a main weapon in battle in the 15th and 16th centuries, whereas the longsword wasn't. Again, probably due to the relative quality of armor to be found on the battlefields in Japan versus Europe. But both the swords were both status symbols to be worn around town. To, say, wow, look at this cool sword this guy has. They could be used in dueling, of course. And the list can continue, but there's similarities in use, in prestige. They bear comparison. And finally, the other commentators have mostly been coming at the issue from a technical standpoint. That is, the qualities of the weapons should tell you how they're going to perform in this kind of business. And that's fine. The question probably can't be completely answered without some assessment of the weapon's technical strength and weaknesses. And by the way, many of the other commentators, I'm thinking of Cerberus Arms himself. He demonstrates some cool cuts and things like this, and tests and that kind of business. Unfortunately, I don't have either a longsword or a katana. Maybe I should. Maybe I actually should have a longsword and a katana to do this. I'll have to ask my wife. So, I don't have any swords to compare physically, but of course I'm coming at this from a historical perspective. I'm going to use the power of history to make my arguments here. And by the way, there is in fact a period of time where the two swords types intersect, where they actually might have even met. Maybe you can make some interesting comparisons because of that correlation. And furthermore, by the way, just so that we're clear, I mean, if we're talking about which sword was better and everything, and you say, well, they never would have met. Well, yeah, they may have. I mean, there was fairly extensive contact between Europeans and Japanese between 1543 and 1640. Portuguese, Dutch, English traders lived in Japan, interacted with Japanese, actually even fought for and against different Japanese factions. There were even Japanese who came to Europe, sometimes forcibly, but we do have at least one account of a samurai who came to many European nations in the early 17th century as a diplomatic mission, where many different Europeans commented on his costume and his weapons, even had like a portrait painted of him. His name was Hasekura Tsunenaga, so look him up if you want to. So it's definitely not out of the realm of possibility that a Portuguese soldier working for some merchants and engaging in battle to save Dom Bartolomeo, aka Omura Sumitada, back in 1578, it's not out of the realm of possibility that, one of those guys crossed his montante with a katana. Although now that I think about it, a montante might actually be more similar to a nodachi. Any spathologists who happen to be watching this, please feel free to weigh in. So the Portuguese fidalgos, for example, they certainly loved waving their big swords around in battle. And to be honest, I would actually be surprised if in the 100 years of actual contact between Europeans and Japanese, there wasn't at least one instance of some European dude and some Japanese dude having a friendly sparring match between a katana and a longsword. Alas, this isn't my area of expertise. I don't actually know any of the Portuguese language that I'm aware of. I guess fidalgos, I know that's like lesser nobility, I think, or the sons of someone, something like that. I think it's similar to Hidalgo, so there's that. Anyway, and my Japanese is actually limited to Anata no denwa bango o oshiete kudasai. So I can pick up chicks in Japan. But anyway, if you're aware of an account, if you are aware of an account where there was in fact a historical clash of swords between East and West, well, let me know. That'd be really cool, actually. Let me know in the comments. But here's the thing, though. That duel itself probably wouldn't really yield us any actual usable, any really usable data for our question. I mean, in order to figure out which sword is better, based on how many wins a person achieves in a sparring match, yuck. You'll actually have to do some weird stuff, right? So one, you'd need two equally matched opponents, or better yet, like a large group of fighters who are all fairly equally matched, to fight a statistically meaningful number of matches, let's say 1,000, in which each opponent, using both the katana and the longsword, fight an equal number of times. And with that sort of experiment, you might be able to get some interesting statistics out of it, but it's still going to suffer from variables. And that would really only address the use of the weapons in dueling, not necessarily in battle. Now, here's the thing. I can prove that the longsword was better anyway, just by using the power of history. So, this is Burly Grit. There are two reasons, count them, why the longsword is the better sword. Number one, it uses greater technological advances in its manufacture. And number two, it's simply a more versatile weapon. So, this is where I'm going to go ahead and criticize Cerberus Arms just a little bit because, well, I think he needs a little criticism here. So he said that comparing the katana to the longsword would be like comparing the 1911 to the Glock. And I disagree. I don't think that it would be like saying, a 1911 or a Glock is better, because the technological gap between the longsword of the 15th or 16th century and the katana of the same time period was far greater than the technological gap between 1911s and Glocks. It would be far better to compare, for example, the 1911 to the Colt revolver. So by almost any measure, the 1911 is a better gun. I mean, it's the one that's still in use, in military, that is. It has a more complex and sophisticated mechanism, right, etc. So similarly, when comparing the longsword to the katana, the longsword simply embodies a greater technological sophistication. The steel technology and the metals available in Europe were simply superior to the ones that were available in Japan at the time. And this is evident by the way the katana is constructed. Now, by the way, let's not think that I'm denigrating the Japanese smiths, because in fact the methods that they used were ingenious to craft as good a blades as they did with the materials they had. But those methods were compromises to account for the deficiencies in their metallurgy. I mean, it's not hard to see that the Europeans made longer, thinner, stronger blades than their Japanese contemporaries. So I can ask a rhetorical question here that I think actually sheds some light on this. Why is it that the Europeans continued to use longswords into the 17th century but never adopted the katana, even though it was known from at least the middle of the 16th century? I would argue that it was because both weapons were becoming obsolescent by the 17th century, and because the longsword was a better weapon. It was less obsolescent, so to speak. So we see in many other instances that Europeans had absolutely no problem taking technologies that they saw as effective and running with them. Gunpowder, for example, right? So I think it's a pretty glaring indictment of the katana that we don't see European examples of the katana pattern swords. I mean, some measures are sort of similar, kind of, but they're developed independent of the Japanese contact, and they're distinctly European in a number of different ways. So my second point here is that the longsword is simply a more useful and versatile, well-rounded weapon. And so let me explain. This is something that Cerberus Arms and many others will will point out as well, right? The katana is a superb cutter. It has that graceful curve to help facilitate cuts. It has a thicker blade and an edge geometry that is more conducive to cuts. And it doesn't really have any other parts that can be very useful offensively other than that one cutting blade. I mean, it can stab, but I mean, the tip and the curvature of the blade make that inefficient. Now, of course, I'm convinced that, again, all of this is using the available materials as best as one can, right? The issue is that katana sacrifices everything for that cut to maximize that cutting ability. The longsword, on the other hand, is an incredibly well-rounded weapon. I mean, it can cut almost as well as the katana does. I mean, one has to be more, careful with edge alignment because of that thinner blade and narrower edge geometry, but there are plenty of tests that show longswords cutting almost as well as katanas. But here's the thing, again, the longsword is not that one-trick pony. It can effectively thrust. It generally has that stiffened tip to, and the longer blade, by the way, to help facilitate stabbiness. It can bludgeon using the crossguard or the pommel. I mean, I think there's probably a reason we call it getting pummeled and not kashira'd. Actually, now I wonder, did the Japanese say that? Did the Japanese, if somebody gets beaten badly in Japan, do they say, oh man, that guy got kashira'd? I would guess not, because it doesn't seem like it's meant for to be able to pound and bash like a pommel is on the European style swords. And I mean, that pommel, by the way, the pommel it means you get a through tang which the Japanese katana does not have. It's just a stronger sort of thing. And of course, that means that the longsword can be effective against tough armor, almost like a mace or a warhammer. That can be used in very close combat, like even wrestling and grappling. The longsword can be half-sworded, again, for armored opponents in close combat, precision strikes. You could turn it and bash somebody with the crossguard. You can do all kinds of things with a longsword that you simply could not do with a katana. Now, let me give you an analogy that I think fits very well. And this is a good historical analogy. You can take this one to the bank. So, in World War II, the Mitsubishi Zero faced off against the Grumman F4F Wildcat and its variants like the FM2 and that kind of thing, for example. And keep in mind, by the way, these two planes would face off against each other through the whole war. I mean, there will be replacements for them and that kind of business, but there you go. And in the beginning of the war, the Zero was basically blasting through the F4F Wildcat. They were, considered to be the feared Zero, right, and all of this. And this may be shocking to you. The Zero was not superior to the Wildcat. And by the way, I'm using the Wildcat for this analogy, but a far better analogy might actually be the F6F Hellcat, which was, a much more versatile and better plane. I'm going to use the Wildcat, though, since I think that many might even argue that the Zero was superior. I don't think it was, and I can prove it. And so the controversy between the Zero and the Wildcat, I think, is more analogous to the controversy between the longsword and the katana. So here we go. When Jiro Horikoshi, or Horikoshi Jiro, however you want to do it, designed the Zero, he was making the best of the available materials. And by the way, what he created, what his design team at the Mitsubishi Works designed, was really amazing, given what they had to work with. So don't for a minute think that I'm denigrating the Mitsubishi design team or Japanese ingenuity. In fact, they made an incredibly fine fighter that stunned the world with its quality. However, they were limited by many different technological constraints, namely engines, actually. So, what Horikoshi did was sacrifice pretty much everything else in order to increase maneuverability and to add cannons. The result was probably the world's best dogfighter, at least until the Hellcat came onto the scene, To be honest with you, even the Hellcat manuals forbade pilots from getting into a turning fight with the Zero, so the argument can be made, in fact I make the argument, that the Zero was the best dogfighter through the whole war. However, this doesn't mean that it was the best fighter plane overall. Just like the Katana may have been the world's best cutter because it sacrificed everything for that cut, the Zero pretty much gave up on everything except for maneuverability and cannons. Until later in the war, when modifications kind of threw off its initial advantages, the Zero had, no pun intended, zero armor, zero self-sealing gas tanks. It had an underpowered engine, an incredibly light airframe, making it incredibly frail and giving it a very slow dive. It had a terrible radio, making pilot-to-pilot communication sloppy or sometimes non-existent. In fact, there's one account of one pilot, I forget his name right now, it just popped into my head, and he actually cut off the antenna for his radio, saying, well, we don't use them anyway, so it's just creating drag. And we can go on and on and on. The only advantage the Zero had over the Wildcat was that it was more maneuverable. That's it. It could turn tighter. I think one could argue, for example, I mean, the cannons were cool. Yeah, those cannons were great, but they only had like 60 to 80 rounds, depending on which variation you've got. And I think one can argue that 4 to 6 50 caliber machine guns is comparable, at least comparable in firepower, to two 20mm cannons. Here's the rub. The minute the Wildcats stopped playing the Zero's game, that is, that they stopped dogfighting, the Wildcat was able to overmatch the Zero. In fact, almost easily, given the sacrifices that were made to improve maneuverability. All the Wildcat pilots had to do was boom and zoom. They just come up here, do a quick dive, shoot down one of the Zeros, and keep diving. And then the Zeros can't follow because they don't have the dive, and then you can come back up and do it all over again. And I'm not even talking about the Hellcat again, but the F4F FM2 Wildcats. They were superior because they were a more well-rounded plane. They could take a hit and get their pilots home. They didn't explode with the tiniest little piece of, the tiniest little hit. So do you buy my analogy there? The Zero was essentially this dogfighting machine. It's not much good at anything else, with some exceptions, which I'm really not going to get into here. Once the Wildcats stopped dogfighting, they held an overwhelming advantage over their opponents. Similarly, the Japanese Katana is essentially a dedicated cutting machine. It's not much good at anything else. I would bet that a person wielding a longsword, if you just don't play the cutting game, you're going to hold a distinct advantage, meaning that, of course, the longsword is the superior weapon. Now, there's a couple of retorts that I think can be used to argue that the katana was the better weapon. If you wanted to retort, you might say, for example, that, well, hang on a second, the katana was actually used well into the 20th century as a battlefield weapon, whereas the longsword pretty much died out in the 17th century with some exceptions. Wouldn't that alone prove that the katana was more useful and thus a better weapon because it was in use all the way up until World War II? Well, maybe, but I think that the reason we see the katana in continued use isn't because of that it was better. More likely, I think that that continued use is due to, 1, self-imposed technological stagnation, 2, an emphasis on form, and 3, cultural importance. So in Europe, we see that the accumulation of martial technology simply made the longsword obsolete. New tactics involving pike squares, massed firearm formations, simply made the longsword ineffective. And the sword of choice then became the saber for cavalry use, or the hanger and cutlass for shipboard use, that kind of thing. In Japan, during the Tokugawa period, we simply don't see that rapid advance in military technology. I mean, take the Tanegashima guns, for example. They were imported matchlock guns that the Japanese actually improved, by the way. And sure, in the late 16th century, their guns may have been the best guns in the world. However, the design essentially didn't change for the next 200 years, and the Japanese were still using matchlock arquebuses when Commodore Perry showed up in 1854. Just so you know as well, they were also still using katanas. We also see that Japan has an admirable respect for tradition. This is one of the things that I think is so cool about Japan and the Japanese people, that respect for tradition. I mean, I would think that's cool because I'm a historian. Now, this is apparent with Japan's living treasures, but I think a good example for our purposes might be the use and practice with the yumi bow. Now, the yumi is beautiful. I would say that practice with the yumi is as good a martial art as any for the benefits that it gives, the discipline and all that. But here's the thing. As I understand it, the focus in Kyudo is on form, not necessarily whether you hit the target or not. I think something similar has happened to the katana that can be traced to the Tokugawa period. Instead of advancing sword types of greater usefulness, I don't know if you can hear the garbage lady, but I can hear the garbage lady. She's getting our garbage right now. Smiths will focus on refining and perfecting the form of the katana. So, we're not concerned with with more useful sword types. We're concerned with making the katana itself more pretty. And of course that does yield some incredibly beautiful swords that truly are treasures. But to revert to an earlier analogy, the most beautifully made Colt revolver in the world wouldn't necessarily mean that it's a better weapon than the most run-of-the-mill 1911. I mean, I'd probably prefer to have one in my personal collection over the other, but preference doesn't equal superiority. And I think that's a good segue into the Japanese national essence. One of the awesome things about Japan was its ability to modernize very rapidly while maintaining its unique identity. That was not an easy thing for the Japanese to do, and it caused a lot of issues and all of this, but they did it anyway. I think that during the Meiji period, there was a focus on using the Western technologies while maintaining their own Japaneseness. And in my studies on World War II, I've heard a lot about the Japanese national essence and how important that was. And I think that the katana is an excellent symbol of it, because it's a cultural identifier that's uniquely Japanese. When you see a katana, it's a Japanese-style sword. And by the way, the Japanese did switch to the saber during like the Russo-Japanese War and that kind of business. You can see their sabers and all of that. But we're going to go back to the katanas as this thing, because yes, it's certainly something to be proud of. And I mean, honestly, given the largely ceremonial role of swords by World War II, why not use the design that is universally recognizable as distinctively Japanese? So the continued use of the katana into the 20th century certainly does not have to mean that it was superior to the longsword. And one final parting shot on that matter. We do see that the katana, in fact, was not an effective weapon in World War II, like, at all. I mean, the only practical use it got as a weapon, not a symbol, was in executing prisoners. And honestly, a longsword or an entrenching tool would have worked just as well for that purpose. Now, the second argument that can be made from a historical standpoint about maybe the katana being superior is essentially the flip side of one of my earlier arguments, and that's that if the longsword was known in Japan for at least as long as the Europeans knew the katana, well then why didn't the Japanese adopt the longsword if in fact it was a better weapon? Now, I could fall back on my argument about tradition, the Japanese national essence, and all of that, but the Japanese did adopt other European weapons and items that were more effective. The Tanegashima guns, for example. And they even copied some patterns of armor and helmet, like they have, like European-style helmets and breastplates that they'll integrate into the samurai armor. So again, why didn't the Japanese copy the longsword then if it's so much better of a sword? Well, I don't think that they could. Remember, Japanese steel technology was not good enough to make the longsword, right? I mean, it was so poor that the katana utilized a number of compromises to produce the best sword possible with the available materials. That technology couldn't produce the type of blade needed for a long sword. Helmets and breastplates and even arquebuses don't require that same quality of steel that's strong, rigid, flexible, robust enough for that long, thin blade of the longsword. And of course, that points again to the Japanese technological stagnation of the Tokugawa period. In the West, new technologies simply made the longsword obsolete in a way that didn't really happen in Japan until at least 1854. I mean, you could probably, push it a little further there as well. And also in the West, there wasn't really a nostalgia for one single type of sword so much as the general concept of the sword overall. That's actually probably why officers' swords in the U.S. military nowadays are like such goofy caricatures of actual weapons. And again, I would ask, if the katana were a superior weapon, why didn't the Europeans, who certainly had ample exposure to it, adopt it in some form? So there you are. I think both sword types are very cool, and they both deserve to be respected. I think they were both effective weapons, but if you were to hold two of them up and ask which one of these is better, the plain answer has to be the longsword. Now, if you think I've missed anything, if you disagree, if you're one of the many others who has weighed in on this matter and would like to offer a rebuttal, I'd be happy to see it. I mean, again, part of what makes this question a good exercise is that you can challenge the position. I think it's cool. And we, of course, grow through challenge. So bring it on. It would be really awesome to hear some other perspectives and other evidence or something that I might have missed. I hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you for watching, by the way. I wish you all joy in your lives, and I hope to see you again soon. And by the way, if you've stuck around for the whole video and are in fact even watching this right now, why not subscribe? Maybe share the video with some friends. If you've got a bunch of sword nerds that you hang out with and want to, enter into a fun debate, share it with them. It can't hurt, right?